It's great to see all of you here and to welcome you to the last lecture in this year's Leading Voices in Public Health lecture series. This is an exciting night for us. I think those of you that have been involved in the series for the last 2.5 years know that over that time I've had the opportunity to introduce people that are my colleagues, my friends, my supervisors, nationally recognized experts, world-renowned advocates, and tonight we've got one person who embodies all of those things, and probably the person among all of them who I professionally respect the most. Dr. David Kessler is in the Department of Pediatrics and Biostatistics and Epidemiology at UCSF, former Dean and Vice Chancellor at University of California, San Francisco, former Dean at College of Medicine at Yale, but of course probably best known to all of us as the former Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. It's always difficult to look back in history, but when David came in as Commissioner of the FDA had just gone through a very serious crisis. There had been a scandal, probably had the lowest ebb of its reputation at any time in its history. Within the years that he was there, about 5 years, by the time he left, it was among the American public the second most respected federal agency after the Park Service, which always struck me as somewhat odd. But David made his mark on the FDA within weeks of his arrival. He reinvigorated enforcement. He put in place a number of important steps to assure the safety of the food supply. He changed the food label. He put in user fees to speed drug approvals. He put in place a number of mechanisms that made drugs for serious and life-threatening diseases available to people even before they were approved. And that was all before he took on tobacco. And though this topic tonight is not about tobacco, I think there was a comparison. In the time that FDA looked into the regulation of tobacco products, the entire perception of the nation changed. When we started, you will recall that the CEOs of the tobacco companies stood in front of Congress and all said that they did not believe that their products were addictive. By the time Dr. Kessler was done with the regulatory approach, the American public knew the facts. And the way he did it was by an incredible dedication to detail and a deep passion for science. And now he's taken that same dedication to detail and passion for science into America's second most important public health challenge, and that is the issue of obesity. So please join me in welcoming the true leading voice, Dr. David Kessler.
This is a very special honor for me because I was invited by Dean Wyckoff, who I had the privilege of, as Randy has said, working very closely, 7 years in Washington, and those were very special years. I'll tell you just the story. You know the food label? It's on all packaged foods, right? That's the nutrition facts. You know, this is the thing. If when you go to pick up those M&Ms and you look at it and you put it back, you know, we're the ones to blame. But it almost didn't happen. We were focused very much on the food label and getting it right. And you know how FDA works, and it has jurisdiction. You know, with the Department of Agriculture, both have jurisdiction over food. So if you have a pizza, FDA has jurisdiction over it. But if you add pepperoni to it, it's regulated by the Department of Agriculture because they regulate meat and poultry. So if you're going to do something together on packaged food, you have to do it FDA and the Department of Agriculture. And how do you do that? And the Secretary of Agriculture wasn't very happy with us because we were proposing to put that nutrition facts panel on all products, all processed food products, and some in the meat industry were concerned that their products would not look very well. So one day he said to us at FDA, I remember it, he said, "I'm taking this to the president." I said, "You're what?" He says, "I'm taking it to the president." So picture the scene, you know, in the Oval Office, George Bush the father, Dan Quayle the vice president, Marlin Fitzwater, James Baker, Secretary of Health and Human Services Louis Sullivan, Secretary of Agriculture, 6 guys who've never cooked in their lives deciding the fate of the food label. And I had been to McDonald's with the kids, and you know they have place liners on the trays, those paper liners? And we got them to put the nutrition facts on that tray liner, and I had kept some of them. So when the Secretary of Agriculture said, Mr. President, FDA has lost its mind, it's not going to make the whole food industry put this on their products, we whipped out that tray liner, handed it to the president, and said, Mr. President, if it's good enough for McDonald's, it should be good enough for the Department of Agriculture. And that's how policy is made in this country. We had the great fortune, I did, to work with Randy on, and you're so privileged to have him as dean. We worked on AIDS together, cancer, Alzheimer's, and obviously for us, very much the big one was the investigation and really going inside tobacco and understanding a lot about that product that we had not understood for decades. And I still remember there was I hate retreats, but we did this retreat because we had to get the regulation, and it was the federal government, and we went to a place, no televisions. We made sure no one could accuse us. It was a boondoggle, but it was pretty intense because the question was, were we going to regulate tobacco? You can imagine how intense. It was only about a 24, 48-hour retreat, and I remember the entertainment there. If you ever need a break, ask Dr. Dean Wyckoff to play the mandolin. It's a special treat. But as we did that, right, I mean, the driving question for me, I thought FDA was about, you regulate safety of and efficacy of drugs and foods, but along the way something happened, and I came to realize that it's not just about regulations or legislation and some set of requirements. You really can have an impact on people's lives, and that was what was key for me at FDA. And so a number of years back, I was sitting in my office at Yale Medical School, and I had a group of residents and fellows with me, and I said, if you want to stay alive, what is it that you can do? Right? What is it you can do for yourself? What are the things we really can do if you want to live longer? Right? And what are those things that are preventable? And I know what you're going to die of. Sorry. All right. 75% of us are going to die of cancer, heart disease, or stroke. Right? And we started pulling all the articles on what we knew about prevention. And I noticed something that was a little striking, because the librarian who was helping me, as she was pulling those articles, lost 30 pounds. Right? Because if we all know that this is a plug. So that's the cover of a book that's coming out in 2 weeks that I've spent the last 7 years working on. But if you just look at the cover, right? And if you can understand this, the cover was done by Chip Kidd, one of the great graphic designers, right? And just make a mental note of what captures your attention on that cover as I'm talking. And if you understand that and the neuroscience of that, you could understand obesity. But what I noticed, this librarian, she lost 30 pounds as she was pulling the articles on cancer, cardiovascular disease, and stroke, because the one common element, of so much of the morbidity and mortality, we know weight, it's not good for us, right? We all have a sense of that, but we really don't have a sense of the extent to which it really contributes to morbidity and mortality. In fact, if you look just at diabetes, right? Diabetes, type 2 diabetes, really is synonymous with obesity. I mean, type 2 diabetes is caused, if you talk to Jerry Shulman, and the best molecular endocrinologist, because it's an accumulation of fat and muscle. And that changes glucose metabolism and uptake of glucose in muscle. So type 2 diabetes really is the accumulation of fat in muscle. And just if you care about public health, I mean, if you care just about health, and our ability as a country to pay for it, back in 1995, 1997, there were 4.8 cases per 1,000 of diabetes. Just over the last 10 years, that number has doubled. The number of cases of diabetes has doubled, and it's because of weight. And if you just look at what we as a country are spending, back in 2001 we spent $7 billion just on drugs for type 2 diabetes, right? 2007, that has risen to $13 billion. It's an issue of profound public health import. I called my friend Catherine Flagel, who's probably one of the best epidemiologists at a CDC. You see those numbers. I mean, something's happening. That's changing right in front of us. That's in the last 10 years. Diabetes has increased that kind and doubled. I mean, what's going on? So I asked Catherine, I said, explain to me, when I was growing up in the 50s, I mean, what was weight like, right? Over a lifetime. How did we change? And how has it changed over the last several decades? So she's in charge of all the NHANES data, the National Health Survey data. And you got to be a little careful because this is cross-sectional data. But if you go back and you look at the 1960s and you just ask over a lifetime, that yellow chart, that yellow line up there, right? This is weight. This is in kilograms. Sorry, I don't know if there's a laser. This is kilograms. So just double this for pounds. And this is a 20-year-old, this is a 60-year-old. And you see that weight basically stayed relatively flat over a lifetime. And when you got older, you lost weight, you lost a little weight in your elder years. And then this was the 1978 NHANES data. This is the 1990 NHANES data. And this is the NHANES data for the year 2000, right? So what do you see in those curves? What's different? What? Right. You certainly have. There seems to not to be this kind of level. There seems to be, weight continues to go up. I mean, into our 50s, right? But the most striking thing, right, is the starting point where you start your adult years. Right? I mean, I remember getting up and saying nicotine addiction begins as a pediatric disease. But when you look at this data, you really see that the problem, in significant part, is beginning before that data. So we used to think, the physiology, we all used to believe that we had a weight set point, right? Why can't I lose weight? And why do I end up going back to that weight? If I diet, I end up going back. We used to think that the body has this weight set point, and it was beyond our control. And that was, the physiologist, the great physiologist, it was a concept called homeostasis. Body regulated itself. Temperature, weight, those things stayed relatively stable. Well, if the body had a set point, right, we would not be getting bigger and bigger. So there's something about it, this is happening before our eyes, right? This is happening over the last several decades. There is no set point. So the question that I wanted to know, if you want to have an impact on public health, is what is driving that increase? And then one night, I am thumbing through the channels, and I'm watching the rerun of Oprah. Right? And there's a woman who, Dr. Phil, don't get me started. Dr. Phil calls up, very well educated, very well dressed, intelligent woman in all aspects of her life. And she starts talking. And she says, you know, I eat in the morning after my husband leaves before work. I eat before he comes home. I eat when I'm happy. I eat when I'm sad, right? And I don't like myself because of it. And I don't understand why I do this. And that, more than anything else, struck me. Why is this woman who's successful in all aspects of her life, if it were just diet and exercise, she would do it? Right? What is it that was driving that woman? And that's what I set out over the 7 years to try to understand, to try to listen as a doc. And what is it that, what were the pieces of that puzzle? Because we have not, I don't think, we certainly have not explained to that woman, nor to the American public, what's going on. Right? So what are the pieces of the puzzle, right? And what's the science and what's the experimental evidence? And stay with me. I won't lose you, I promise. Okay, but I'm going to take you into some of the science. Okay, a couple of pieces of the puzzle. Okay, that if you start putting them together, I think you will begin to see what's driving obesity in a new light that we've not understood before. First, in the presence of a varied and limitless diet, animals and people, right, tend to eat excessively. Right? Now, how do I know that? So if you give people excess food, and it's varied, right, people will eat more and more. Right? Now, so just to substantiate that, this is a curve of a graph from Peter Rogers. And these are laboratory animals, and this is over their lifetime, and they do gain weight over their life from their young days, to when they're older. And if you feed them just plain laboratory chow, they gain weight according to this orange graph. Put in their cages what he called a supermarket diet. Stuff you can just buy in the American supermarket, right? And what you see is that the weight gain is these graphs. What's that? Peanut butter, crackers, chocolate chip cookies, other than laboratory chow, right? And you make it freely available. Those animals tend to eat excessively, right? You take that away, and they come down in their eating, but it doesn't come down all the way. So the first thing we know, availability, right, type of food, can stimulate appetite. But what's behind that? Okay, why do they keep on eating more and more? Why this huge jump? If I put peanut butter and chocolate chip cookies in those cages, well, we used to think it tastes good, right? But what's behind that saying it tastes good? So with colleagues Diane Latterman and Jeff Grimm at the University of Washington, we published a paper, and it's not the usual typical scientific article title, but we call it Deconstructing the Vanilla Milkshake, right? So what's in a vanilla milkshake? What's in a vanilla milkshake? Ice cream, right? So it's sugar, it's fat, right? And its flavor, and its temperature, right? When you really break down a vanilla milkshake, sugar, fat, temperature, that's what's in a vanilla milkshake. So what's the driving ingredient? What gets you to keep on eating the vanilla milkshake? How many think it's the sugar? Raise your hands. Okay. How many think it's the fat? Right? How many think it's the flavor? Right? So what we did was we tested different combinations, and these are, and I won't spend a lot of time, these are tests to see how much an animal will press the lever, right? And how hard an animal will work for whether food, fat, flavor, and whether they'll keep on pressing it. So first time you press a lever, you get the sugar, right? Second time, you have to press it 3 times. Third time, you have to press it 9 times, so it's a variable ratio. And the question is, you look for the break point. How hard is that? I mean, you're going to press it 65 times and then get the pellet? Or you're going to press it 100? How long are you going to keep on working for the substance? Right? And what do you think they work most for? It was sugar. Right? And in fact, that's what these data show. When you have sugar and fat, okay, it is, if this is just the sugar curves, and if you add fat, you don't see any difference. So sugar is the main driver on the variable ratio tests. But what you see, and these have to do with fixed ratios, not variable. So what we see is that fat does, in fact, add some synergistic effect on the fixed ratio tests. So there is something about sugar alone, right? Sugar's the main driver, but fat makes it also increases the reinforcing power of that milkshake. So what we now know, when you look at those curves, why those animals are eating more and more, the fact is that fat plus sugar, fat plus salt, fat plus sugar and salt each stimulate intake. Now, we used to think food was to fill me up. It was to satisfy me. Now I'm saying fat, sugar, and salt stimulate intake. Right? That's a different way of thinking about food than we've thought. Right? Because fat, sugar, and salt, that trifecta, is not there to satisfy me. I mean, it's also stimulating me. Now, so that's so we know in a limitless and varied diet, animals will eat excessively. We know now that fat, sugar, and salt will stimulate. Second piece of the puzzle. Let me give you the third piece of the puzzle. Okay? We are wired to focus our attention on the most salient stimuli. What does that mean? Okay? What that means is if a bear walks into this lecture hall right now, you're going to stop listening to me. I promise you. Right? You're going to focus on that bear. Okay? We are wired to focus on the most salient thing, right? The thing that's the most important, to us. If your kid is sick right now, at home, you're thinking about your kid. That's grabbed your attention, right? And that's how we survive, right? So we're wired to focus on the most salient stimuli. That's what makes us human. Right? The dopaminergic system, the most salient stimuli, that bear captures our attention, it causes arousal, and it causes us to act. Right? The fact is, and this is the third piece of the puzzle, is food is designed increasingly to achieve a remarkable salience or prominence in our mind. Go back to that cover of the book. And I didn't realize, Chip Kidd did the cover, and I didn't realize that the book tells the whole story. Right? What captured your attention on that cover of the book? Anyone remember the cover? No, it wasn't. It was a carrot. Is it a cake? Right. Which was more salient to you? The carrot cake or the carrot? Okay. Now, why is that? It's yummy. Is that what it is? Right. It's pleasurable. Right? But it's more than that. The most salient one is the carrot cake, and that captures your attention. Right? So you are wired. Right? I mean, there must be somebody in this. Admit it. There's somebody here who focused on the carrots, right? It's important. Is there somebody who found the carrots more salient? See, it's not that. Right? Each of us are going to be different. Each of us are going to find something else salient, right? Each of us get our rewards differently. It may be the carrots. There are only a few in the audience, I will admit, right? Now, what goes into deciding whether something is salient for us as an individual? And what I did, and I really probably shouldn't admit this, I spent about a year dumpster diving. Because I wanted to go inside the food industry to understand what's in our food. I mean, how has food become so salient? So, I went to one of the local casual restaurants in the neighborhood, and here is there's a margarita chicken, grilled chicken, perfectly, healthy, right? Grilled chicken, I ordered it. And when you start looking, right, and you go into, and you find out what's this margarita grilled chicken, you soon realize that chicken has been injected, right, with this marinade. At least if marinade's fine, but that marinade has orange juice, lemon bar mix, triple sec, soybean oil, tequila, salt, injected, and then tumbled in this big cement mixer. So what are we adding to this chicken? I mean, what's in this stuff? What's in? This is fat and sugar. Sugar, fat, and salt being injected into that chicken, right? I mean, pick a favorite appetizer. Name it. Pick a favorite appetizer. Somebody.
Shrimp cocktail.
Shrimp cocktail. Right? What? Buffalo wings. Come on. Right? Buffalo wings. Right? What kind of sauce?
Oh, hot
Hot buffalo sauce.
butter and Tabasco.
Right? So let's just so let's dissect it. What's the buffalo? If you look at the buffalo wings, right? The fatty part of the chicken, deep fried, put in
Butter and Tabasco.
the buffalo sauce first before you have the creamy stuff. Right? Is what? Is sugar, salt, and fat. So you fry the chicken, and then you add another layer of sugar, fat, and salt, and then you have this dip sauce, this cream. And what's in that? Fat and some salt too. So you have, let's see if we get this right, fat, on sugar, on salt, on fat, on sugar, right?
Yummy.
Right. And you wonder what's going on. Name another one. Seriously, name another appetizer. I mean, what? Spinach dip. Spinach dip, right? Spinach dip is, what's in spinach? It's that cheese. It's cream cheese most of the time. What?
Spinach.
No. See that? You don't have this right. It's fat and salt with a little green stuff that makes you think it's good for you, right? So food is increasingly layered and loaded. But I called up one of our collaborators, Gaetano Di Chieri, and and started trying to understand again, why is it certain things capture our attention, right? Why are these things salient? Why are those buffalo wings? We just think it tastes so good, right? And Di Chieri, we worked on a series of experiments. He's in Italy, and what he showed was he studies dopamine response, and dopamine in our brains signals the most salient stimuli. So if that bear walks in, you have the dopamine spike, right? It both affects fear as well as pleasure, right? If something is novel, if something is extraordinary, you'll have that dopamine spike. And normally, what scientists had always thought was that dopamine spikes with food, and it also spikes with drugs, but with food is different because, it may spike initially, but then it habituates. We become used to it, and it doesn't spike each time. But when you take food, right, and you make it reinforcing, when you make it multisensory, when you take fat, sugar, and salt, rather than any individual component, what Di Chieri showed, in our experiments, is that the dopamine doesn't habituate. Each time you eat these combinations, you get these brain spikes, right? Of dopamine. So there's no habituation. It's as if the stimulation, right, each time was being sustained. That was the laboratory animals. So the food industry has created foods to be highly salient stimuli. We've always said, well, it just tastes good. But these are really very powerful and potent and multisensory foods. And the more these become, the more sugar, fat, and salt, this trifecta, the more multisensory the food becomes. The texture, the taste, the dynamics, right? The flavor dynamics. You add all those, the crunch, right? The changes in your mouth, the spiciness. The more potent and multisensory the food becomes, the greater the reward, the more the reinforcement learning, right? So, and how does this work in our brains? I've told you that food can stimulate us, fat, sugar, and salt can stimulate us, and the more sensory the food becomes, the more you have this stimulation. But where does the real power come from this food? How does our brains work, right? The next time you get hungry, think for a second. Because you get hungry because there's always a queue. Every time, I can tell you, when I land back in San Francisco airport, as soon as that plane lands, on the runway, I start thinking about these Chinese dumplings, right? Just on the taxiway, no matter what time of day there is, because at the airport there's this great dumpling place. And all I know is I've learned to remember Pavlov, the bell, right, and to me it's the plane and the dumplings on the runway, right? And so as soon as you laugh, but there's always a cue, whether it's the time of day, right? If you see the chocolate, if you had put chocolate chip cookies out and you had cued people, people would be taking it. There's always a cue. Because the power of food, the power of this multisensory food is our ability of our brains to anticipate, because of that cue, those rewards, those pleasures. So I'm walking down Powell Street, right, in San Francisco, and I start thinking about chocolate-covered pretzels. Why? 6 months earlier, I had been into a place on that street that it sold, but I went in and I had these chocolate-covered pretzels. Fat, sugar, and salt, right? Very multisensory, and have the power to condition our behavior so that the cues can predict when we're going to anticipate. That could be location, it could be time of day, it could be smells, it can be airports. So if you look at, there's almost, just picture a cycle in the center, right? So it starts with a cue, you get an urge, there's a reward, and you build this habit, right? So you get this cue, urge, reward habit, right? And what makes that even worse, that cycle? If you deprive somebody, you make them hungry, that makes the reward value of food even more. You stress somebody, you make them angry, you provoke their emotion, that makes the reward value more. And if you prime them, if you get them started, they don't stop. So you have this cue, reward, this cue, urge, attention, arousal, reward, and if I get cued and it takes over my working memory, right, it triggers me, my attention, my arousal, how am I going to get out of my working memory? How am I going to relieve that once I get cued, once I get activated, once I get aroused? What do? I'm going to eat, right? Or if I can just make it past the baggage, past that food court in that airport, I'm not even thinking about it anymore, right? So when you have multisensory stimulation of the nervous system and you cue people, right, that cue is part of that cycle. Highly palatable foods, fat, sugar, and salt. Those buffalo wings, you know what they are? You say, and you're right, they taste good, they taste great. But in essence, they're hot stimuli. They activate our nervous systems. And cues activate the brain circuitry that guide behavior. This is a diagram. No, it's not a bunch of spaghetti loops on a plate. This is the diagram from the scientist, the late Ann Kelly, on the neuroscience of natural rewards, on a paper that she's published. And there are specific areas of the brain, in the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, right, that process, that are responsible, right? Those, when I'm cued, and I'm cued about something that's highly pleasurable, highly sensory, right? There's an activation of that part of the brain cue, attention, arousal, reward, and then release. And then what happens the next time I land in the airport? Every time I eat it, what do? I strengthen the neural circuitry so that the next time I eat it again. So the behavior becomes rewarding, but it also becomes self-sustaining. So I do it over and over again. Now I was very interested in what does this mean? What about Sarah, this woman? I mean, what's going on with her? This is that we think we understand, the science, right? I mean, of these cues activating these parts of the brain. But I wanted to understand how many of us have this kind of reward-based eating, right? And so I picked, what are the 3 characteristics? Right? Let me give you 3 characteristics. Loss of control, self-reports, right? Just a sense of loss of control in the face of highly palatable food. So if I'm stimulated, I feel that there's a pull of these foods. A lack of satiation, a lack of feeling full in the face of highly palatable foods, and a preoccupation, thinking about these foods in between meals. Take those 3 characteristics, right? And we went back and we said, all right, let's study a population and understand how many of us have these 3 characteristics. And we went back and we looked at this Reno Heart database of about 500 people that had eating behavior data with us, and looked for those 3 characteristics: loss of control, lack of satiation, preoccupation, thinking about food. And we found that about half of obese people, about 30% of overweight people, and 17% of healthy weight people self-report high scores on all 3 characteristics. Now, if you extrapolate, and there's always risks of extrapolation, how many millions of people? If you look at the population and say 50% of obese, 30% of overweight, 70% of healthy, that's about 77 million people. If you do that extrapolation, okay? We self-report those 3 characteristics. So that woman on Oprah who's saying, I eat when my husband leaves in the morning, I eat before he comes home, I eat when I'm happy, I eat when I'm sad. This loss of control, this not liking herself. And I can vouch, I have suits in every size, right? I mean, I've been 70 pounds heavier. But there is a phenotype. There is a syndrome, if you were. Not a disease, but because it's a natural part of being human. But for millions of people, right, there is this constellation of this loss of control, lack of satiation, and preoccupation with food that no one's ever explained. That characterized. Now, we all probably have this. It's a continuum, right? All of us probably have this to some extent. If I say, and there's very few of you, somebody, right? Somebody in this audience doesn't care about food, right? Or there's no magical pull. About 15% of the population. And they're the ones you really have to study. Because the question is, why is food not salient? Right? Now, the fact is that it's not just food. There are many stimuli that can be salient. So it can be gambling, it could be sex, it could be alcohol, right? It could be food, it could be certain types of food. Our nervous system, we're designed to get captured by the most salient stimuli. Now, what those salient stimuli are different for each of us. But for many of us, what's the most salient thing? Absent a real catastrophe on a day-to-day basis. I mean, it's food, and it's food that's captured. Now, what's interesting about when you look at this, the 17% of lean people have this syndrome too. This sort of conditioned hyper-eating, I call it. And why do lean people? How can people be lean if they have it? And if you study those lean people, what you find is that there's a high degree of restraint. They have taught themselves. I mean, it's almost white-knuckle force. I mean, they live in torment with themselves, right? Yes, it's not good for me. Yes, it would taste great. They're always debating in their head, right? But they've learned a set of behaviors, right? And a set of rules that they live by. So yes, they still have this pull of the food, but they've learned to be able to control their weight. But what you see is that certainly this is weight related. The more you have, a greater percentage of people who are obese, overweight, have these three: loss of control, lack of satiation, preoccupation with food. And what is it? What is it that's driving this syndrome of conditioned hypereating? So we developed this hypothesis that highly palatable foods. What's highly palatable foods? Foods that taste good, but what's the scientific definition that I've given you? Sugar, fat, and salt, right? That this sugar, fat, and salt is excessively activating the reward mechanisms. The reward mechanisms, this part of the brain, right, of susceptible individuals, and that activation drives wanting, right? Because I get cued, my focus is my attention, I get aroused, right? And if I start saying, once I get aroused, and my attention is focused on this food, and I say, well, it's not good for me, what happens? What happens when you say, I don't, my attention's focused, my brain's activated, and I'm going, I shouldn't do that. That's when craving begins, right? Because you have this, you only accentuate the reward value. So what happens is highly palatable foods hypothesis is excessively activating the reward mechanisms of the brains of susceptible individual, and that drives wanting for highly palatable foods, which in turn leads to excessive eating. So you have this cycle that we're in. And I gave this talk. I was asked to talk to a group of food industry executives. I flew to London. It was a small group. And I said, let me make the point pretty clear. Let me see if I can give you the analogy of how this works. And there are differences, but just follow me for a second. Nicotine. We worked on nicotine. Nicotine is a moderately reinforcing substance. Animals will work for nicotine. Nicotine itself as a chemical is not that, if you look in animal studies, animals will push the lever for it and they'll self-administer it, but they won't go crazy. Right? But it is moderately reinforcing. Add to that nicotine, the smoke, the throat scratch, the cellophane crinkle of the pack, the color of the pack, right? The cowboy, the time of day, the emotional appeal, the advertising. There was independence and glamour and sexiness, and so you took nicotine and you added all these other sensory and emotional components, and what did you end up with? A highly addictive product. I give you a pack of sugar right now, and say, "Go have a good time." You're going to look at me and go, "What are you talking about, Kessler?" Right? I add to that pack of sugar what? Fat. I add to that temperature. I add to that color. Right? I put it on every corner. I can tell you you're going to do it at the end of the day when you can go do it with your friends. Right? It's going to be entertaining. You're going to walk in and they're going to be telling it's going to be like a carnival. Walk into a Friday. I mean, it's a right. Food's entertainment, and what do you end up with? Right? You take a moderately reinforcing substance like sugar, you add all these other components, it becomes highly salient, and what ends up happening? You may not realize it, but it captures, for millions of us, right? It becomes a very salient stimuli that's out there, and it captures, whether we want to admit it or not, okay? It captures our nervous system. So let me just review for a second, all right? What's going on? Food is powerful because it's rewarding, okay? It tastes good, right? But the most effective rewards are those that can change how we feel.